Do you guys know what Palestinian laws actually say about homosexuality? If you are queer and advocate for Palestine, you've probably heard that if you go to Gaza or Palestine in general, you'll be thrown off of a roof. And while homophobia is definitely common in Palestinian communities and is a problem, homosexuality is actually not criminalized in the West Bank. And in Gaza, same-sex sexual activity is prohibited under the British Mandate Criminal Code Ordinance, which was a law that was inherited by the British. This law penalizes same-sex sexual activity with 10 years in prison, and it only applies to men. Though according to the organization Human Dignity Trust, there's very little evidence that there is a heavy enforcement of this law in Palestinian society, specifically in Gaza. Now, have people been killed for being gay in Palestine? Yes, they have. But it's important to differentiate misinformation from real information when it comes to understanding homosexuality in Palestine and why it is so controversial, specifically in Palestinian communities. Now, again, homosexuality is not illegal in Palestine in the West Bank. However, it is extremely taboo. And this is because a majority of Palestinians live in very conservative communities, and they regard homosexual activity as a sin. However, even though that is the case, if an individual is to persecute another person for being gay, they will be arrested. So technically, under Palestinian law, you are not allowed to harm queer people. However, it's not like there are any laws specifically that are passed to protect the queer or LGBTQ community. It actually turns out that out of the 70 countries that have criminalized homosexuality, almost half of them have also adopted those laws from the British. Now, most of these countries are in the Middle East and they've kept those laws, but not all countries in the Middle East have criminalized homosexuality. Jordan, for example, was the first Middle Eastern country to decriminalize homosexuality, and it actually did so in 1951, which is approximately 10 years before Israel decriminalized homosexuality. Now, Jordan and most Middle Eastern countries do still enforce homophobic policies and are extremely homophobic, but queer people do exist in the Middle East, and they do organize and produce films and productions and art, and are working in a very hostile environment to promote change, though it is not nearly as dangerous or barbaric as Zionist propaganda makes it out to be. Now, going back to Palestine, one of the conditions that are unique to Palestinians that queer Palestinians endure is that they are under Israeli occupation, and their queerness is subject to exploitation. But it's not by Palestinians. Their queerness is used against them by Israeli occupation forces. Palestine has been under occupation or siege for over 50 years, and one of the strategies that Israeli occupation forces use to collect intelligence about Palestinian leaders is blackmailing queer Palestinians, or even blackmailing Palestinians who engage in taboo activities like drinking alcohol or premarital sex. Now, I've said this before, this taboo exists because most Palestinians live in very conservative communities, and in their religion, homosexuality is a sin. And so is drinking and premarital sex. And Israeli forces know this, so they use this against the Palestinians who do commit those sins to, again, collect intelligence about either Palestinian leaders, people who like to protest, or anyone who just doesn't want to live under Israeli occupation. Now, the consequences for being queer in Palestine vary from individuals to families, but it's not nearly as common or as barbaric and dangerous as Israeli propaganda or Western media in general will have you think. I'm not denying that homophobia is a problem in Palestinian communities. However, it's important to understand what's right and what's wrong when we're gathering information about Palestine, and certainly when misinformation about the treatment of queer people in Palestine are being used to justify the mistreatment of all Palestinians. Far too often, people say that if you go to Palestine and you're queer, you're going to get thrown off of a roof. And this belief comes from viral videos of people getting thrown off of roofs in Arab countries. And these videos are often labeled as Hamas doing these actions, when in reality, these videos are taken from ISIS or other extreme terror organizations throughout the Middle East. Now, if you want to know the fundamental difference between Hamas and ISIS, I've spoken about it before and I can speak about it again. And I'll leave the link to the video where I spoke about it in the comments. Now, regardless, I'm not saying that Palestinian people do not have extreme homophobic views and that it is safe to be queer in Palestine or in the Middle East. For example, if you look up actual cases of Palestinians being killed for being gay, you'll come across the case of Ahmed Abu Marhiya, who was a Palestinian man who allegedly escaped the West Bank to Israel because he was under threat by his family for being gay. And when he did end up returning to the West Bank, he was tragically beheaded. Now, the reports on this case, including from the Times of Israel, state that there's not a lot of information regarding how he was able to escape Israel. He entered Israel illegally, but nobody knows how he came back, why he came back, and the real motives of why he was beheaded. Now, again, this is according to the reports that have reported on this incident. And while he was tragically beheaded, both the Palestinian media, his family, the police, and Palestinian Authority deemed this act of beheading as completely barbaric and as crossing a red line in Palestinian society, whether in terms of morals, customs, or basic humanity. So although it is unacceptable to be gay in Palestinian society, it is absolutely illegal to kill somebody for being gay or to kill somebody for any reason. And this is something that Zionist propaganda does not like to mention. Now, are we limited in the information that we can collect about this topic? Yes, we are. However, the information that we do have does tell us that it is illegal to kill somebody for their sexual orientation. So it's not like it is a legal or formal custom for Palestinians to actively harm homosexual people in Palestine. Now, I did some research to figure out what actually happens to queers in Palestine, and outside of the very popular case of Ahmed Abu Murhiya getting beheaded and another queer man getting killed in the West Bank for spying for Israeli authorities, I'm going to share every single report on the Palestinians who have been killed for being queer in Palestine for the last 24 years. In 2023, a teenager named Sarit Ahmed was shot and killed by her two brothers for allegedly being queer. In 2020, Sarif filed a domestic violence complaint to the Palestinian Authority, and she moved to her sister's house who lived in another village, and her brothers were convicted and put away. But after her brothers were released, she was found and targeted and tragically shot dead by her brothers. Now, according to a document published in the European Parliament in 2003, in the year 2000, there were 4 reported cases of murder related to a person's queer sexual orientation. In 2016, the New York Times reported about a homosexual man who was killed by Hamas because of gay sex and theft. So what happened was this 34-year-old Hamas commander oversaw about 1,000 soldiers, and he was interrogated after it was suspected that he stole money from the brigades and took it for himself. Now, after he quickly confessed to stealing the money, he was interrogated further, and it was a brutal interrogation of him and his family, and it was eventually revealed that he was having gay sex with a man who claimed that he had sex with this Hamas commander. And after the interrogations, a man confessed to Hamas that he was having sex with the slain Hamas commander, and then it was concluded that this Hamas commander took that money to pay off this gay man, and Hamas commanders agreed that it was too risky and that if Israeli intelligence caught this act and were able to collect information about Hamas, this guy may have caved and it would just not be good for Hamas operations. So the guy was killed. Now, I also found the case of a transgender Palestinian teenager getting stabbed by a family member in Tel Aviv, and this happened in 2019, and Israeli police suspected that it was his brother who carried out the stabbing, but luckily the teen was not actually killed, and this act of violence ended up setting a huge protest in Palestine against LGBTQ violence, and it included 30 organizations and hundreds of Palestinian demonstrators. Organizers of this protest informed the media that this was the first time that Arab media had to face the reality of homophobia in their society, and they were forced to talk about it. And according to Jawara, a queer Palestinian activist who has been an activist for the past 10 years in the LGBTQ community, he said that although Palestinian society can be closed-minded and a bit intolerant of LGBTQ people, that a teenager was attacked by his family for his sexual identity is rare. Now, you might feel like the reports of Ahmed Abu Murhiya and the stabbing and the killing of that teenage girl is far too many acts of violence against queer people in Palestine, and I would completely agree with you. That said, I would still argue that homophobia and even violence against queer people in Palestine is not enough of a reason to put Palestinians under occupation, and it does not help the queer people who are living in Palestine. And this harsh reality doesn't justify the genocide of Palestinians either. I would also argue that the discourse surrounding the violence in Palestine is dramatically skewed, with a lot of misinformation, often conflating ISIS with all Palestinians, or even just Hamas, and I'm not the only person who thinks this. In my research, I found an article by an editor for the Institute of Palestinian Studies, where he responded to a Haaretz Haaretz article that basically generalized the experience of all queer Palestinians based off of the testimony of one queer Palestinian. And he criticized that queer Palestinians are often reduced to being victims and are stripped of their own agency and voice in these matters. And they're often exploited by Israelis to advance Israel's image around the world, making it seem like Israel is a safe haven for gay people, especially Middle Eastern gay people, but that is really not always the case. Now, I've purposely incorporated the narratives of queer Palestinians because, as the queer Palestinians that I'm talking about mentioned, this is a discussion to be had by Palestinians for Palestinians. Now that we've gotten a more factual understanding of hate crimes in Palestine, let's get into what hate crimes look like in Israel. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that I am by no means implying that it is safer for Palestinians or Arabs to be gay in Arab countries like Palestine. And this is especially considering that in Israel, queer people are not 100% safe and not all of their rights are acknowledged by Israeli law. In fact, under its current rule, there has been an increase of hate crimes against queer people, with a record number of 3,309 hate crimes towards queer individuals in the year 2022. And there's also been an 11% rise in harassment reports against LGBTQ people, with around 35% of those harassment cases happening in public areas. Now, homophobia does not stop at hate crimes in Israel. Ministers in Israel's Knesset are openly homophobic, and they even go as far as saying things like homosexuality is a bigger threat to Israel than Hamas. Now, like in Palestine, a lot of this homophobia is rooted in religious beliefs, right? But why is it that Israelis insist on stretching the truth when it comes to homophobia in Palestinian society, but refuse to acknowledge the homophobia that exists within their own society? And there's so much more that I can say about this topic, but for the sake of this video, I'll just leave it at that. And I actually have a whole playlist on TikTok where I talk about homosexuality in Palestine, so you can check that out. I'll link it below. And of course, if you want to read more about this, as always, all sources in the comments.